Everyone right now is trying to increase their energy. People are taking stimulants, supplements, NAD boosters, wearing red light devices, even shining lasers on their forehead, trying to force more energy into the system. But if energy alone solved the problem, why are modern people so exhausted? We have more stimulation than any generation in history. More artificial light, more calories, more caffeine, more dopamine, more information, more biohacking. Yet fatigue is everywhere. Brain fog is everywhere. Burnout is everywhere. So maybe the problem is not simply a lack of energy. Maybe the real problem is that the body is losing the structure required for the energy to flow properly. And I think red light therapy is actually a really good example of this misunderstanding. Now, to be clear, I actually think red light therapy is very beneficial in many contexts, and I even use it myself. So I'm not against red light therapy at all. There's legitimate research behind photobiomodulation, and to understand why people are interested in it, we need to understand what the mitochondria is actually doing. Mitochondria are not just little batteries producing energy out of nowhere. They're maintaining electron flow through the electron transport chain, creating proton gradients across membranes, and using that gradient to generate ATP. This process depends on extremely delicate organization. Electrons have to move efficiently. Oxygen has to be available. Membrane gradients have to remain stable. The redox environment has to stay balanced. One of the main theories behind red light therapy is that certain wavelengths of light can interact with components of the system, particularly cytochrome C oxidase, which is part of complex 4 of the electron transport chain. Cytochrome C oxidase helps transfer electrons to oxygen, which is the final electron acceptor in the aerobic metabolism. The theory is that protons may temporarily influence the behavior of this enzyme. One of the proposed mechanisms is that nitric oxide can bind to cytochrome C oxidase and partially inhibit respiration under certain conditions. Red or near infrared light may help dissociate nitric oxide from the enzyme, allowing oxygen to bind more efficiently again. And this raises a much bigger physiological question that we'll get into more deeply in another video. Because when CO2 is chronically low, the body tends to rely more heavily on nitric oxide signaling for vascular regulation. And that raises an interesting physiological question. Whether chronically low CO2 and increased reliance on nitric oxide signaling could alter mitochondrial regulation in ways that increases the apparent benefit of photo. So then the question becomes, how important is red light therapy in a healthy physiological terrain versus a dysregulated terrain with low CO2, high oxidative stress, poor oxygen delivery, and chronic sympathetic activation? Because those are two very different biological environments. In a healthy system, when circulation is strong, oxygen is unloading properly, CO2 levels are stable, and mitochondrial gradients are already functioning well. Red light may act like a useful supportive signal, a small enhancement, a mild push to a system that already has the structure repaired to utilize energy efficiently. And the more coherent and organized the system becomes, the less it may need external energetic interventions in the first place. But in a dysregulated system where blood flow is impaired, oxygen delivery is compromised, stress physiology is dominant, and the body is chronically overbreathing, the limiting factor may not be mitochondrial stimulation at all. The limiting factor may be the terrain itself. Because if the system cannot properly deliver oxygen, maintain vascular regulation, or sustain stable cellular gradients, then adding more stimulation may provide only limited temporary effects. That's the distinction I think most people are missing. That could temporarily improve electron transport temporarily, which may slightly improve ATP production and cellular respiration. Red light therapy may also influence reactive oxygen species signaling, local circulation, vasodilation, inflammatory pathways, and cellular stress responses. And this is important because a lot of the benefits people feel may not actually come from massive energy production. Instead, they may come from subtle shifts in signaling or circulation. For example, slightly improved blood flow, slightly improved oxygen utilization, temporary reductions in inflammatory signaling, or mild improvements in mitochondrial efficiency. And this can absolutely create noticeable subjective effects. So some people do feel good benefits from red light therapy. They may notice better recovery, less inflammation, temporary mental clarity, mild mood improvements, or changes in circulation. So I'm not saying red light therapy does nothing, but the internet has massively exaggerated what is actually happening physiologically. I mean, I've seen people talk about shining a laser on their forehead like they are deeply energizing the brain, healing neural networks, massively increasing cerebral blood flow, or dramatically restoring mitochondrial function. And that's where the claims start falling apart. Because one of the biggest problems is penetration. Red light does not penetrate deeply through tissue. Even with the laser, the light still has to pass through skin, blood vessels, connective tissue, the skull if you're doing it on your head, and biological tissue scatters light heavily. A large percentage of that energy is being absorbed, reflected, scattered, or dissipated before it ever reaches meaningful amounts of brain tissue. Some estimates suggest maybe only 1 to 5% ever makes it through the skull. And then the remaining light still does not penetrate deeply enough into the brain itself. And that's one of the many reasons why many researchers have shifted towards near-infrared wavelengths instead of regular visible red light. Because near-infrared penetrates somewhat better. But even near-infrared still has limitations. People imagine a laser beam deeply flooding the brain with energy, like science fiction. That's not what's actually happening. Most of the effects are probably modest, localized, superficial, and signaling based. But honestly, even the penetration issue is not the deepest problem with the theory. The deeper issue is this: energy by itself is not enough. Energy requires organization. It requires structure. You can stimulate mitochondria all day long, but mitochondria do not function independently from the rest of physiology. They depend on oxygen delivery, blood flow, vascular regulation, CO2 balance, pH stability, membrane gradients, automatic regulation. So in other words, energy production depends on the terrain surrounding the cell. And this is where I think CO2 becomes more fundamental physiologically, because CO2 is not simply adding energy. CO2 regulates cerebral blood flow, oxygen unloading into the tissue, vascular tone, respiratory chemistry, and nervous system state. Even small increases in CO2 can significantly increase blood flow to the brain. And that's established physiology. So while red light may provide a localized stimulus, CO2 is influencing the entire environment the brain operates within. And that matters because the body does not just need energy, it needs an organized flow. A healthy system does not merely produce energy, it distributes energy coherently. Think about modern life. People are overstimulated constantly. Artificial light, stress hormones, information overload, hyperventilation, poor sleep, constant sympathetic activation. The problem is not simply low energy. The problem is disorganized physiology. And adding more stimulation into a dysregulated system is not the same thing as restoring order. That's why I think a lot of modern health approaches miss the bigger picture. They keep asking, how do we force more energy into the body? Instead of asking, why can't energy flow properly anymore? That's a completely different question. And I think it leads to a completely different understanding of health. Red light therapy may absolutely have legitimate base uses. It may help recovery, inflammation, skin healing, certain aspects of cellular signaling, and possibly even some aspects of brain function. But it does not bypass physiology. It does not replace circulation. It does not replace oxygen delivery. It does not replace respiratory chemistry. It does not replace systemic regulation, because life is not powered by raw energy alone. Life depends on organized energy flow. And the future of health may not come from forcing more stimulation into the system, but from restoring the structure that allows energy to move coherently through the body in the first place.